Welcome to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process by which sunlight is converted into stored energy in chemical bonds that almost all life on Earth depends on. Organisms that are not directly photosynthetic are reliant on photosynthetic organisms for their energy. There's a very tiny percentage of organisms that don't use photosynthesis or rely on photosynthetic organisms for their food. So we're used to thinking of plants for photosynthesis, although the plant kingdom aren't the only photosynthetic organisms. There are photosynthetic bacteria, which we already talked about, cyanobacteria in the Origin of Life unit. Cyanobacteria were the first organisms to evolve a type of photosynthesis that released oxygen as a waste product. And they continue to do that today. And if you remember from that chapter as well, cyanobacteria are the ancestors of chloroplasts and the other plastids that are the reason that eukaryotic cells can photosynthesize. So euglena, which are eukaryotic protists, and dinoflagellates and kelp, also protists, their chloroplasts are the endosymbionts that used to be free-living cyanobacteria 2 billion years ago. So organisms that are photosynthetic, like plants, protists that are photosynthetic, and cyanobacteria, we call those autotrophs. Autotroph means self-feeding. They get all of their energy from sunlight and turn that energy into the energy in chemical bonds in organic molecules. So they take that energy and turn it into sugars, proteins, and fats, and then consumers like us get our energy that way. The only carbon source that photosynthetic organisms need is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has no stored energy in it. There's no potential energy to be harvested from carbon dioxide, but that is the raw building block that photosynthetic organisms use to build first sugars, then proteins and fats. So these organisms are photoautotrophs. So photoautotrophs use light for energy. There is another type of autotroph, chemoautotrophs, which there are some bacteria that use chemicals from volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean, like hydrogen sulfide, as a source of energy. And we talked about those briefly in the Origin of Life unit. We're heterotrophs, so heterotrophs eat others. So whether you're a rabbit eating plants or you're a carnivore eating herbivores, you're heterotroph, and you're getting your energy from photosynthesis ultimately. We also, as eukaryotes, rely on the oxygen that's produced as a byproduct by most of the photosynthesis on Earth. Plants produce most of our oxygen today, but cyanobacteria and photosynthetic protists also produce a very significant amount of the oxygen that's in our atmosphere. And if you remember from the Origin of Life unit, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, not oxygen gas, not free oxygen, until cyanobacteria evolved and started producing oxygen as a byproduct. So the very fact that we have any oxygen in the atmosphere today is due to the constant production of oxygen by photosynthetic organisms. Even the energy that we harvest from underground, the so-called fossil fuels, which would include everything that's made from crude oil, natural gas, and also coal, these are all photosynthetic energy from the sun that was stored millions of years ago. Coal, crude oil, and natural gas were formed millions of years ago when huge forests were buried and did not decompose completely. And those carbon to hydrogen and carbon-carbon bonds were stored and continue to have stored energy today. And when we burn fossil fuels, we are returning carbon dioxide to the atmosphere that was removed from the atmosphere during the time of the dinosaurs and slightly after that as well. So all photosynthesis today produces oxygen as a byproduct, with the exception of some bacteria. So the photosynthetic bacteria that are not cyanobacteria, they don't produce oxygen as a byproduct. They are using a more primitive type of photosynthesis, one that evolved first. It evolved earlier than the type of photosynthesis that cyanobacteria do. And so we're going to mostly talk about the type that cyanobacteria and chloroplasts perform. But if you're going to take micro, which some of you are, you'll learn a lot more about the different types of bacteria that perform other kinds of photosynthesis that consumes carbon dioxide but does not produce oxygen as a byproduct. So here's our overall photosynthetic reaction. Carbon dioxide and water plus energy from light produces sugar and oxygen. And just like in respiration, if you remember in respiration, the oxygen that we breathe does not turn into carbon dioxide. The oxygen we breathe ends up in water molecules, and the exact opposite is happening here. So in photosynthesis, water is split, and the oxygen that ends up as a byproduct of photosynthesis, these oxygen atoms are derived from water, not from carbon dioxide. So, and it's two completely separate processes. Just like in respiration, carbon dioxide is produced by the Krebs cycle and by pyruvate oxidation, and oxygen is consumed in a completely different reaction in the electron transport chain. The same thing is true in photosynthesis. Oxygen is produced in the light reactions, the first step of photosynthesis, and carbon dioxide is consumed later in the Calvin cycle. So they're not even in the same process. But we're going to go through that. So it's a two big steps in photosynthesis. And the word itself, photo means light. Synthesis, that word synthesis means take smaller bits and put them together into a larger bit. That's what synthesis means. And that's what we're doing in photosynthesis. We're taking smaller bits, carbon dioxide, and linking them together into a larger molecule that has potential energy. So these two molecules here, no potential energy. They're the bottom of the barrel energy-wise. Why? Remember our redox reaction, that things bonded to oxygen, that bond has no stored potential energy. So carbon dioxide, no potential energy. Water, no potential energy. But this is a glucose molecule. We do have potential energy. All the carbon to carbon bonds and carbon to hydrogen bonds do have potential energy. That energy comes from sunlight. So photosynthesis takes place in chloroplasts, and again, we're going to focus on eukaryotic photosynthesis. And the carbon dioxide gets into plant leaves through pores called stomata and goes into particular cells that are specialized for photosynthesis, the mesophyll cells. And inside a mesophyll cell, as we saw in lab when we got to look at some plant cells under the microscope, a single cell is packed with chloroplasts. And the chloroplasts are much smaller than the plant cell themselves. One plant cell might have several hundred chloroplasts. And the chloroplast has 3 layers of membrane, and the inner membrane here is the thylakoid membrane. And this word is one you need to know. So the thylakoid, each one of these little pancakes is called a thylakoid. And they're colored green here because that's where the chlorophyll is. Chloro means green. So chlorine, chloroplast, chlorophyll, they have the Greek root chloro in there because they're green. So the thylakoid membrane is green because it contains chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a molecule. Chlorophyll is the molecule that starts photosynthesis, and we'll talk more about that. Don't worry about the word granum. That's a stack of thylakoids. I'm not going to ask you for that word. You do need to know the word stroma. So the cytoplasm of the ancient cyanobacteria here we call the stroma. And the stroma is going to be important because it's the site of the synthesis reactions in photosynthesis. The thylakoid membrane is where the light capturing reactions are, and the stroma is where the synthesis parts of the reactions are. So we'll talk about both of those. So here's our reactants and here's our products, and this shows you where the atoms are going, because we have oxygens, hydrogens, and carbons. It's good to keep in mind where they're going. Okay, so the carbons in carbon dioxide end up as the carbons in sugar molecules, which is the initial product of photosynthesis, is sugar. One of these oxygens is going to stay with glucose, because if you remember, in a sugar, every carbon has an oxygen, at least one bond to an oxygen in a sugar. And then some of the oxygens are going to end up in different water molecules that are the result of the reaction. The oxygen that's released is all going to come from water. So the first reaction, light, the energy of light, is going to be used to split water and strip the electrons away from oxygen and bounce those electrons up to a higher energy level, because they're at a low energy level here. They're going to be at a higher energy level over here. And this is a redox reaction. It's the reverse of the redox reaction that we looked at in respiration. So carbon dioxide is being reduced to sugar, and water is being oxidized to oxygen. So remember, reduction is gaining, oxidation is losing. So carbon dioxide here, the carbons have no control over the electrons because of the oxygen, but in a glucose molecule, the electrons are going to be at a higher energy level. Now carbon has more control over electrons. It's sharing them equally with hydrogens and other carbons. So reduction is gaining. It has gained electrons. Oxygen loses electrons because here in a water molecule, oxygen can hog all the electrons. But in oxygen gas, it now has to share them equally. So oxidation is losing. So oxygen here gets oxidized. So that's what, just like in respiration, we followed where the energy went. The energy went from being in the chemical bonds in a glucose molecule to being carried by an electron carrier as high energy electrons, to moving down the electron transport chain, to being a proton gradient, then finally to ATP. So this is going to be the reverse of that. And again, follow where the energy is going. Where are the high energy electrons? There's going to be a proton gradient here as well that's going to be used to generate ATP. So there's going to be some similarities with this and respiration. So first we'll talk about the light reactions, that's the photo part of photosynthesis, and then the Calvin cycle, that's the synthesis part of photosynthesis. Sometimes the Calvin cycle is also called the dark reactions because they can take place in the dark as long as there are electrons and ATP. So the light reactions take place in the membrane of the thylakoid. Water is going to be split, oxygen gas is going to be released, and here's another electron carrier. Just like we had NAD plus in respiration, we have NADP plus in photosynthesis, and it does exactly the same thing. It can grab two high energy electrons and carry them on to another reaction. And we're also going to make ATP during photosynthesis. But instead of being released out into the cytoplasm to do cellular work, in this case the ATP is going to be used for the synthesis reactions. It's going to be used to create sugars from carbon dioxide. And this big word here, photophosphorylation. You remember, phosphorylation just means we stick a phosphate on something. You can phosphorylate anything by sticking a phosphate on it. So when we make ATP from ADP by adding a phosphate, that's phosphorylation. And we call it photophosphorylation because light was the energy source for that. So the first step is the light reactions. And let's just look at what goes in and out of all of these reactions. So here's our thylakoids. So we need water because we're going to split water. That's going to be our source of electrons, is going to be water. The energy source is light. And here's our electron carrier in its oxidized form. When it's carrying 2 electrons, it's reduced. And then there's ADP and inorganic phosphate. So what's going to come out of the light reactions is oxygen gas. This oxygen is going to be released as oxygen gas. And then ADP is going to be phosphorylated to ATP, and NADP is going to be reduced. So now at the end here, this energy of light is now in the form of ATP and high energy electrons carried by NADPH. So these can go on to the synthesis reactions. And you notice carbon dioxide isn't even involved yet. So all we did was collect the light energy and turn it into chemical energy in ATP and electron energy in NADPH. The dark reaction, so this, the Calvin cycle is often called the dark reactions because they can take place in the dark as long as we have ATP and NADPH, the 2 sources of energy from the light reactions. So, and this in fact happens in plants and other photosynthetic organisms, that when the sun goes down, the dark reactions will continue until ATP and NADPH run out. They also require a source of carbon dioxide. Without carbon dioxide, there's no raw material for making the sugar. So when we take carbon dioxide and attach it to a larger molecule, that's called carbon fixation. And this is, again, you know, we've encountered this over and over, it's kind of old-fashioned words that have become frozen in some science phrase. And here's another one. So fix, an old-fashioned meaning of fix, we use fix now to mean repair. But fix also meant attach. And the only time we ever hear that sense of the word today is if you say, use affix. If we say, affix that to the wall, you mean attach it to the wall. So carbon fixation means to attach carbon dioxide to the carbon in carbon dioxide to a larger carbon-containing molecule. That's carbon fixation. And that's the important part of the synthesis reactions or the dark reactions. So the Calvin cycle, which takes place in the stroma of the chloroplast, we have carbon dioxide here is the carbon source, and what goes in is 2 forms of energy, ATP and NADPH, our high energy electrons, and the high energy electrons are going to be used to reduce carbon dioxide to sugar. So, and a 3-carbon sugar is the first thing that comes out, as we'll see, G3P, our friend from respiration. So I'm not going to show you the little video right here because the sound won't be very good for you. You have access to the PowerPoint, so you can play this video. I'm also going to try to find a version of this on YouTube and stick it in our playlist so that you can watch it. It's just a little summary video of photosynthesis. Animations, I think, are helpful. Okay, go on to part 2 now.